can help you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everybody. Recognizing that all protocols are observed, I have the unenviable task of talking about the way forward, particularly after the litany of necessary woes that we heard for the most part of the morning. But that's good, because as far as I'm concerned, that is essentially the critical importance of the kind of forum that we have here this afternoon, because we could not, in a sense, attempt to move forward unless we had a good appreciation of the difficulties that we faced in the past and we can continue to face if we don't take full advantage of this period of review that we are anticipating and, in a sense, are currently involved in. I am particularly heartened by the comments that we just heard from Mr. Harry Paul, who is the chairman of the Law Review Commission, because that part, the former chairman, that particular, or the Law Reform Commission, sorry. That particular commission is one of the major partners that we look forward to participating with as we move forward, because we have to take full advantage of this period of review in the light of two things. As the chairman mentioned in his original discussion, the Police Service Commission was fortunate to have had a meeting with the Prime Minister, the Attorney General, and the Minister of National Security a couple of weeks ago. And in that particular meeting, she gave the commitment to work along with the Police Service Commission, and this forum, in a sense, provides us with the first opportunity to allow those two ministries to be intimately involved in, one, the difficulties that we faced in the past, two, the opportunity for the review to adjust those difficulties, three, to, as Mr. Harry Paul mentioned, no laws are perfect. It gives us an opportunity to reflect on the shortcomings and the lacuna of the past laws to improve as we move forward. The whole idea is, and he mentioned the difficulties involved in the political understanding that created these laws. But as far as I'm concerned, that political adjustment is in fact probably the best thing to have happened to the Republic in recent years, because it does provide us with the political will, if you may, as expressed through the Parliament, to set the governance structure for policing and democracy in this country to move forward. And I think it's incumbent on us to take full advantage of that opportunity presented as we move forward. So that from my standpoint, and from the PSC's in general standpoint, this afternoon is beginning to ripen, if I may use that. I see it as an opportunity. And in that context, I will invite you to follow through with me a little bit on the question of challenges of the way forward. Yes. I'm not going to repeat exactly what's on the board, but the overview was essentially what I mentioned without looking at the presentation. And the whole idea is that once we can use some of the things that we discussed this afternoon, by providing the political will to allow for the transformation of policing and its administration in the context of a national government or governance structure. What we in the Secretariat did was that we looked at some 5 thematic areas that will help us to move forward within the context of the remit of the Police Service Commission. The first one, monitoring and evaluation of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. The second, human resources. The third, public communication, followed by organizational reform and the legislative reform. You heard this morning about the human resources limitations, but just to update you on that, the appraisal policy for the Commission of Police, the police executive, and by extension, the police service, has already been completed. Now, that appraisal process was an extremely rigorous one because the Police Service Commission had recognized that in this first go-round, you wanted to be as objective on that appraisal process so that the criteria and the entire appraisal process was done bearing that in mind. As Ms. Cheeseman mentioned this morning, the process itself has been already discussed with the Ministry of National Security, as well as the Police Commissioner and his executive, and that in the very near future we will be embarking on that first exercise. As each of the executives of the police service come up for their own appointment review period, that exercise will continue along those lines. Much of what the DPA had mentioned this morning is an indication of not necessarily, and again, we don't want this entire conversation to focus on either personalities or specific institutions. What we see as we move forward is an appreciation of the fact that the Commission's department essentially was a major factor in beginning the process of institutional transformation away from what was in the past, taking into consideration what that constitutional amendment allows us to do going forward. So that we feel quite appreciative of the role of the Commission's department in making that transition. What we are also very clear about is that given the urgency and the critical importance of moving ahead, because if we don't, the crime, the fear of crime, and as the roundtable itself says, strengthening partnerships for improving public safety. The elements of that crime have moved so fast and furiously in the past that we cannot afford not to get our institutional architecture right to ensure that we limit the negative effects of that. So we looked at the kinds of strategic objectives that we needed to focus on for the future of the Police Service Commission. And within that context, looked at each of the 5 criteria that we talked about to see how we can move ahead on that. We, in a sense, came up with something like a matrix tying these 5 criteria to our strategic objectives, both for the medium as well as the short as well as the medium term. What we are looking at here is the thematic areas in the first column, the short-term requirements to meet those thematic areas, the strategic objectives for that, the medium-term requirements, again, on each of the thematic areas, and the strategic objectives to meet them. So what we are doing here is first trying to determine within the context of the remit of the Police Service Commission and the 5 thematic areas, how best we can achieve those objectives both in the long and short term. Now, getting back a little bit at the question of the thematic areas. We can walk through quickly the different thematic areas according to the short and medium-term requirements. The first one was an appraisal form for the Commissioner of Police and Deputy Commissioners, and that's already been done, as I mentioned earlier. And that comes under the monitoring and evaluation of the Police Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, and by extension, the Police Service. And let me pause here for a minute to mention that the question of by extension also has to do with the resource limitations that Ms. Cheeseman mentioned this morning, because in looking at the by extension approach, we have one unit of the Secretariat called an audit unit that has now to be incorporated, and we are looking at that through the PMCD and their approach to our revised requirements, so that the audit unit is able to look at the police service within the context of monitoring and evaluation, over and above the Commissioner of Police and the Deputy Commissioner of Police evaluation. For the medium term, we anticipate that the appraisal document which we currently have is going to be far more comprehensive to take into consideration what we just mentioned about the police service itself. And the strategic objective of that, obviously, is to improve the appraisal tool and to engage the process fully. Here again, that also has implications for human resources as well as training. On human resources, the immediate thing is to approve staffing complements for the functional units. And again, I want to repeat that we do already have cabinet approval for a full staff complement of 49, and we are currently operating at less than 50%. So that we are in the process of, once these things are satisfied, coming to the end of that institution building process that we started under the aegis of the Commission's department. What we want to do in the medium term is to move towards capacity building on that institutional process. We also want, in a very critical and important way, to introduce the whole question of institutional autonomy and strengthening, institutional strengthening, along with capacity building. So I was particularly happy to hear this morning from the Law Review Commission that there is a possibility and likelihood, and this is something that we ourselves within the PSC will be advocating in the short term in a very, very serious way, to changing the institutional architecture of the Police Service Commission, given the critical and important role it now has under the new constitutional mandate. Now, we are not quite sure whether that's going to, from a law reform position, we would be very much interested in working along with you so as to give us some alternatives on how quickly we can achieve something like that. Because at this stage, speed and efficiency is of utmost importance. Now, public communication is that there's an immediate need reflected in the objective of widening citizen participation in an effort to keep the stakeholder publics fully engaged in the process of good policing to engender public trust and confidence. Now, I sort of deviated a little bit from the way forward matrix just to indicate to you how critically important this business of public communication is, because the public is not necessarily interested in coming to stakeholder meetings like this. They don't have the appetite for that. What they want to know is that tomorrow morning they can safely walk outside and not be that overwhelmed by the fear of crime. Now, it's important to be able to let this be a part of our long-term strategic needs, and that the critical importance of the short-term requirements and the medium-term plans to get to those objectives. To be able to do that, we are incorporating currently the design, development, and maintenance of an appropriate website, as well as attracting the requisite staff. Critical to this endeavor so that the Secretariat and the PSC can move forward quickly with its remit. Organizational reform, again, is the most important thing that we need to look at shortly. The core of the objectives, both for the short and medium-term strategy,